I'm so excited to have my friend here, Alex Drane. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
The sort of impetus for this conversation was actually not about a webinar. It sort of came up as I was taking the journey, as we all were this past fall, around the election and managing a business and the sort of prolonged impact of the COVID pandemic. And I was asking a lot of questions about noticing that I was feeling some judgment in my life, and really turning to sort of the people in my own personal network around how they've really connected to empathy when it felt elusive. And I knew a little bit about your journey. I'm going to literally pull out the paper because my friend Alex is so fabulous that her bio needs a roll call. But wanted to pick up the phone and call Alex and say, this is what I'm struggling with. These are the questions. How would you advise? And as part of that process, felt like I may not be the only person sort of wrestling with where we are in the world and how to personally and professionally navigate through, and recognizing that, Alex has an incredible, I think, just center around issues of empathy, but also a unique set of experiences that opening up the conversation to have it such that anybody else who might be interested could participate and or benefit from your perspective and experiences was really the origin of this call. It kind of drove my comms committee crazy because they were like, who do you want to join and what do you want them to do? And I was like, I just want to call my friend. And I'm pretty sure these are hard conversations that other people might be interested in. And so for those of you who are on the line, I want to introduce Alex to you. She's a increasingly dear friend to me personally. She's the co-founder and CEO of Rebel Health and ARCHANGELS. She's a wellness expert at the Prudential and co-founded this really amazing company called Eliza. Also engaged with Grace, other bootstrap companies. She's always building better ways and better companies for us to do good in the world. She's been named by Top Women in Healthcare's Entrepreneur of the Year. She's been recognized by Disruptive Women in Healthcare's Women to Watch. She's been recognized by the Boston Globe as one of the top 100 women leaders. 40 under 40, Future Health List's top 100. I mean, the list goes on and on. So thank you for making the time today and sharing your perspective. Given that this is an hour where we're going to talk about empathy and recognizing that the world is in absolutely surreal, crazy place right now. How are you?
It's funny. So when you and I were talking this morning about this conversation and having over the last couple of days, I said, I'm not sure you can ask me that question because I might cry. And I thought I was going to cry because my dad had an ablation this morning and we are on the other side of it. But I spent the whole morning. Ablation is a procedure to zap a part of your heart that's causing, in his case, supraventricular tachycardia. And I really spent all morning thinking I was going to throw up. And when we talk about empathy, it's just such an extraordinary thing to me how people everywhere, wherever you look right now, people are going through something. They're afraid about something. They're worrying over somebody. They are panicked about some outcome. And I know that it's my life's work. And it still never stops surprising me how surprised I am when I spend, the last week, there's just a lot of stuff in my life, from a caregiver perspective, wanting to throw up and having a hard time concentrating. And then actually thinking that like work is respite. I love work right now because I can focus on work and not worry about all the things I'm worrying about. And it's just such a reminder. I'm very lucky. I'm sitting in my home office. I'm not an essential worker. I don't have to be leaving my house. My dad's getting the very, very, very best care. He's okay. And I know there are so many situations across the country right now where that's not the case. And so it just makes me feel very aware of how lucky I am. And that's we were joking, that's my rational brain. Like, I feel so lucky. I'm so very lucky. This is a wonderful thing. And then my lizard brain was the one that was like, and I want to throw up because I'm so panicky and because I'm so anxious. And I think I'm constantly trying to tell my lizard brain to be quiet and use my forebrain, but I fail at that quite frequently.
Yeah. I really appreciate you always being human, right? Um, I'm reflecting on this weekend, someone who's very dear to me, sort of saying, I don't feel okay, right? Like whether it's seasonal affective disorder or this COVID thing, I just don't feel okay. And because she named it, then we could be in it together, right? And so I think as people who are really good at like keeping all the balls in the air and have been taught that like, especially in, I would say, venture, which has its own set of gender norms, like naming the thing isn't the norm. But until you name it, like you don't know what resources are out there. Like sometimes it's just a hug, right? Sometimes it's just like, I'm so sorry. That's a lot. And sometimes it's like really practical, constructive help. But I think to the extent that, we as leaders, especially as female leaders, have the ability to like bring our whole selves to the conversation, I think that matters. And I think it will matter increasingly as we get to the other side of this pandemic, because people have been really confronted with the realities of like, sorry, there's not work in life. We all live in this crazy world, and there's a good chance that you'll see my pandemic puppy eat something that she shouldn't over the course of the next hour. But to the extent that, you model that, I just want to reflect back to you that really matters. Like it matters to all of us. It makes it possible to have that conversation. And so you're just very special. So thank you for that. Thank you for, coming here to talk a little bit about both the professional and the personal piece, because I think we're all looking for that right now.
Well, I'm grateful that you say thank you. I know a lot of people who have to deal with me all the time who are like, God, I wish you would just shut up. But one of the things you said, I think really, really, really matters, and it matters right now. And I think it matters a lot for the work that you're doing, because you're not just supporting the unpaid caregiver, you're supporting the paid caregiver who supports the unpaid caregiver. And when we think about that, the data, the statistics around what you were just alluding to, which is, we're not okay. And that's true across the board. It's especially true for certain at-risk populations, of whom unpaid caregivers are one of them. And I know, Ashley, you'd seen some of our data from the study that we published with the CDC, that and this was data from May, June, that a full 56% of unpaid caregivers are struggling with clinically significant anxiety or depression. 1 in 5, they have had a 5 times increase in their substance use. And 1 in 3 unpaid caregivers had thought about suicide in the month leading up to our survey. And I think that's just a really extraordinarily important baseline. That was in May. Things have not gotten better, they've gotten worse. And they've gotten worse for these at-risk populations. COVID has exacerbated that. And I think, for your friend, I'm giving her such a smooch and a hug. And I think people being transparent about where they're struggling gives other people permission to see themselves reflected in that and to own that that's true for them as well. And then they can go pay it forward by also being vulnerable, because the reality is, I don't know anyone right now who's not somewhere on the spectrum of anxious and depressed, or feeling isolated, or feeling like they're failing, or some other sense that things are not okay, because things are not okay. And I think it's, important for each of us to own that for ourselves, and to give other people permission to see that in themselves, and we can actually bond on that on some level.
Yeah, and be in it together, right? Even if it sucks, we're in it together. What you're reflecting back on your work with caregivers is exactly what we're seeing in the data with Wellist as well. So in the last 12 months, someone is 4 times more likely to need financial assistance. they're 3 times more likely to be searching for emotional support, behavioral health resources. You know, in Thanksgiving, we literally saw a spike that week. The domestic violence resources spiked into our top 3 most requested categories. But the reality is, and we've learned this, 7 years supporting patients with consumer tools so that patients can raise their hand in the privacy of their own home or internet, that you can't see on the surface who needs help. You just can't see it. And so, I'm really interested sort of chronologically going back to your work at Eliza. You built this amazing integrated communications company, I would say 20 years before, this is what everyone's talking about right now, right? Communications, engagement, empathetic, patient-centered experiences. I'm curious, as a healthcare leader, what did you learn about using empathy as a strategic competence for driving value in healthcare? Like, how did you come up with that thesis? What did you learn as you were building that company that might be relevant to those of us sort of trying to emulate that today?
So I have to laugh because I always get panicky when somebody reads anybody's bio, right? Because your bio is always like what someone's put on paper, and I was like, who is that person? Because what I can tell you for sure about everything that Eliza learned how to do well, we learned by not doing things well. And all of the ideas that we had about what would work and what healthcare was and how we should be supporting somebody's healthcare were patently wrong. And we learned that by listening really, really hard. And back to the discussion about money raising, because we had no money, we had to do what our customers were willing to pay for. And in the end, that meant we had to be engaging folks actually. And we got a lot of hard feedback. I'll give you one of my favorite early examples when Eliza was just starting. The way that we got paid was our first sort of big success, you can call it, as a product, was supporting HEDIS. So using this automated communications platform, at that point it was solely automated speech recognition, to reach out to individuals in their homes to get them to do something that they weren't otherwise going to do or had not done. And what was new about Eliza is we were the first company to ever do this using over-the-telephone speech recognition. We actually had a patent to do it. And the reason we wanted to do it outbound is because our thought was anyone who's calling into the healthcare system, they're already engaged, they're already getting something, and that's awesome. But we need to be supporting people who are not calling in. So we did this outbound calling. And I remember the first time we realized how stupid we were in the way we were writing scripts was we said to someone in the beginning, has anyone ever told you, has a doctor ever told you that you have diabetes or a touch of sugar? We'd learned that we had to use these other words besides just diabetes, because depending on where you're from, diabetes is not necessarily a term that you're familiar with as much as you might be familiar with something else. And in the first time we listened when we went live, and the first person said yes, and we would be listening in the background to see how the automated system all worked. And our response that we had pre-recorded was great. Because in our mind, it was great. Like, we were supposed to call people who had diabetes and get them support in their diabetes. And so we were so excited. Oh my gosh, here's somebody with diabetes. And then we heard it, and we heard the person's voice that was recorded fall. And the person being like, that's not great. You could feel, and I remember just like crumbling inside, be like, we are so not smart. How could we are thinking about this from a healthcare perspective, not from human in their home being asked if they have, diabetes, and we just got excited that they do. We got excited because we have a healthcare perspective. They're not excited because they have a human perspective. Let's never, ever again approach a human with a healthcare perspective. Yeah. And then the other example I can give you was over time, as we did more and more of these interactions, when we were reaching out to talk about diabetes or get your mammogram or do whatever it was going to take to help you get the outcome that our customers, big health plans or big employers or PBMs, wanted these individuals to have, we did it then in a much more empathetic, beautiful, warm, and loving way. But we were still trying to drive people to do the things that were, I'll call it traditional healthcare. Diabetes, get your mammogram screening, take care of your cardiovascular disease, get your preventive, screenings, take your medication, whatever it might be. And slowly but surely, we started to recognize that if we stopped listening for what we expected and listened to what people were actually saying, if we said, will you get your mammogram? Do you plan to get your mammogram in the next 3 months? And somebody said no, we would ask follow-up questions like, oh, okay, is that because you're afraid of finding out the results? Is that because of transportation? And we finally learned, we did all the research driven reasons that we thought somebody was not doing these things. But if somebody said no, no, no to all the reasons we offered for why they hadn't, we finally started asking an open-ended question at the end. Okay, well, why haven't you? And overwhelmingly, what we heard in beautiful, beautiful tones of voice was, oh, I would love to. My mother with Alzheimer's just moved in. Or I'm really afraid I'm going to lose my job. Or I just can't focus because I'm going through divorce. And slowly but surely, like dragged, kicking and screaming, we came around to this notion, maybe we're focused on the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
And maybe the biggest diseases in the US are actually these life challenges, what we would now call the social determinants. We call them the unmentionables, specifically caregiver stress, financial stress, workplace stress, and relationship stress. And it's funny, in the examples you just gave, domestic abuse, domestic violence, alcohol, like we know COVID, the stress of COVID is driving up these things, these coping mechanisms that we use, these outlets that we have that are not healthy. So it was a journey of having no option. It wasn't that we were smart. It was that we had this listening platform that turned into a megaphone that kept yelling at us, you were not looking at the right stuff. And then once you started to see that, and we could put some data behind it, it became so clear so quickly. Just think of the stats you just shared. Oh my God, this is very, very real. And this is driving health. And actually health is life. And we need to find ways to measure the impact that life is having on health so we can convince our customers that's what you need to be focusing on. That's where impact can happen.
Yeah. I'm reflecting on a conversation I had last night and the power of open-ended questions, right? In full candor, I wake up every day and count down the days till my parents can get vaccinated. And we have had some of our employees, because they're on the front lines, been offered and opt out of getting vaccinated, which I am very anxious about. I feel very strongly that based on the data, there was an article in the New York Times that said of 38,000 people in the Moderna and Pfizer studies, one of them had a serious case of the coronavirus, right? That we're underselling this. And so I've always thought about this as a access to information, that there's incongruent access to information. If everyone had the same worked from the same set of data, that we would all get to the same things. And my question to my colleague and your friend was, first of all, it was, when you get the chance, will you get vaccinated? And I thought the answer was going to be like, yes, absolutely, sign me up. And she said, I don't know that I would, but my mother said to me, you can't kill your grandmother. And so I'm going to get vaccinated. And we were talking, she said to me, Ashley, you have to remember, we have a legacy of medically abusing our communities of color, and we have eroded trust. And so you're thinking about, how do I get people connected to the right information, the right science? They don't care about that. Literally, we don't trust it. And if you're going to have the conversation, what you need to do is tie it to a human connection. And candidly, you don't get to have that conversation. And as I'm thinking about how do we take something that feels to me to be very relevant, and I, in my narcissism, feel very strongly that there's a right way, really being open to maybe it's not, right? And so as you're thinking about breaking down and getting to better understandings of all the people that we aspire to help, what, aside from open-ended questions, do you tap into as tools to get to a different level understanding. And sometimes for me, that's a different solution or healthcare intervention. But sometimes it's, wow, maybe all the things and agenda that I bring to this conversation aren't the right ones. And as you're thinking about working with caregivers specifically, like how do you draw that line? What are your sort of go-to methods or process in managing that for yourself?
You know, there's a Quaker phrase. I'm a Quaker. That's called answer to that of God in everyone. And you could insert God for whatever you want, right? But answer to that of what you think is good in everyone. And I had a locket when I was growing up that had that on the back. And every time I can be very spiteful, fierce, too opinionated. And every time I would feel myself getting judgy in a situation, I like to move fast. Somebody was moving fast enough. You know, whoever was checking me out wasn't going fast enough. Person in front of me wasn't driving fast enough. I would hold onto the locket and I would say, answer that I've gotten everyone. Because what I will be thinking about is, you know, you don't know what's going on with that individual. You have no idea. And I have seen this play out over and over and over again in my life, that every time I am quick to make a judgment about somebody, if I just be quiet for a minute and ask a couple questions and know more about who they are and why they are thinking the way they are or not thinking at that moment because they're panicked. Well, why are they panicked? What's going on? What is the full picture surrounding this individual? It is impossible to not have empathy on some level. And so for me, it's always an exercise of what am I not seeing? And another phrase my mom taught me, it's funny, my parents have been extraordinary. I have 3 parents, my mom and my dad, stepdad, and my dad. And all of them very unique in the lessons that they've taught over the years. There was a night that I said to my mom, I had to walk through, you know, a part of this neighborhood that I don't know very well. And I was anxious. And she said, well, you should go walk through that neighborhood every single day until you're not anxious, because that's just you not understanding that neighborhood. And I think and she was right. And so I always, every time I begin to feel myself feeling, it's a type of judgment. It's to me an indication, then you need to go put your body there until you don't feel judgy anymore, until you understand that at our core, humans are really, really beautiful souls. And we can't understand the complexities and realities of what's going on for an individual. And it's our job to try and figure that out. Because if we do, you will not be able to avoid having empathy, period, end of story.
I think you really model this well. And I think it tees up, you know, after having this great big exit, you ended up as a cashier at Walmart. Like, what was that about? How did that come? How did you get to a point where that felt like the right answer? And what did you learn?
I think it was absolutely a midlife crisis. So I'll start there. And what had happened was we'd sold Eliza. And for any entrepreneur, Ashley, pay attention. At some point, if you sell your company, it's hard. And I think for me, it didn't necessarily feel like a success because there's this quote, data is just humans. Data is just humans, or statistics are just humans with the tears wiped away. And I don't think I necessarily felt when I left Eliza that we had done all of our work, that we were done. There was so much more that we could have done. And when we looked at what we wanted to do next, we looked at the overlap between the things that we learned at Eliza, broaden the definition of health to include life. When life goes wrong, health goes wrong, specifically caregiver stress, financial stress, relationship stress, workplace stress, and the work that we had done with Engage with Grace, which was a lesson learned in a really, really hard way in an overtreatment death of my sister-in-law who died when she was 32. And we did a terrible job. We technically did a great job supporting her. We got her the best care. We were, you know, did everything, but that's actually not always the right thing. We didn't get palliative care involved. Hospice wasn't involved until the last day. And when leaving and deciding what to go do next, decided to focus on the overlap of those two things, which for me was the caregiver, because you really can't change this country without changing the way we live our very best days until our last. And the first attempt we made at ARCHANGELS was all about celebrating caregivers as these archangels, as these warrior angels, and reframing the way that we would do that, understanding that caregivers are a much bigger population than a 46-year-old woman caring for her mom. And the way that we went about rolling out archangels initially was to use the tools that we understood, which is to roll it out through health plans, and to roll it out in a way that didn't allow us to be as edgy and unconventional as we wanted to be. And so it failed. And sort of going through all of that, I felt so clearly in my body what we needed to be doing for caregivers. And I felt so frustrated at the failure that we'd had in not being able to do it well, that I felt as though I was being asked to go speak as an expert. And in my experience, like the second you're an expert in something, you better be careful, because you're actually not an expert. You just got overly comfortable with what you think you know, and the world has moved on, and you're not an expert anymore. And I sort of had this gross feeling like, you don't know what you're talking about, and you can't make this work, and you live in a bubble, and everybody around you is in a bubble, and you need to get out of the bubble. And everyone's like, well, you should go volunteer. Go volunteer, X, Y, or Z. And I thought, if I volunteer, that's not actually putting your body there. That's just having a visit. And then you're going to say that you're an expert because you had a visit. You're not an expert. And so I was already in love with Walmart. Walmart was had been early customer of Eliza's. And one of my dear friends, Marcus Osborne, love that man. I called him and said, Marcus, I feel like I live in a bubble and I want to be a cashier at Walmart. Get me a cashier job at Walmart, please. And there was this long pause. Have you met Marcus before? Mm-hmm. Okay, so there was this long pause, and then he burst into laughter. Marcus has no guile. Like, he literally has no poker face. If he's laughing at you, he's laughing at you. He's laughing at me, not with me. And he was like, did you just hear yourself? And I was like, yeah, you need to get me a job at Walmart. I live in a bubble. I need to be a cashier. And he said, you just said, I live in a bubble. So, hey, Walmart executive, you get me a job as a cashier at Walmart. He goes, get your own bleep, bleep job. And he hung up on me. And I had this like terrifying moment. It was the beginning of my exposure to being uncomfortable, being deeply uncomfortable, applying for a job in a way that I had not ever applied for a job before, and going in and having my interview. The first day that I was on the job and went to go, do you remember what it's like when nobody wants to sit with you and you go to the cafeteria and you look around? Well, like going to the break room and everyone's in their bubbles. And in fact, a lot of folks at my store, 2660 North Reading, love you, they're speaking Spanish with each other. And no one has any interest in inviting someone to come sit with them. Why would you? And feeling terrified, like just example after example of feeling so outside of my comfort zone, until it is amazing how adaptive humans are. Day after day, quickly, people who felt scary became best friends, and situations that I could never have imagined being in became my favorite things to be part of. And this was during the election 4 years ago. And I had coworkers who, if I had had a conversation with them outside of my job at Walmart and heard their political beliefs, I would have been judgy and said, like, that's crazy, I don't agree with you. And I would have had no context for understanding their response. And now, one of the things you do is you clean up the aisles when you're a cashier, and in between, if there's not a lot of stuff, you're like putting everything in the right place. And I would often be talking to coworkers, co-associates, and we'd get into political discussions. And because this individual, I'm thinking of one particular situation, was my friend, I listened really hard, where I never would have otherwise. And so that, for me, just that recognition, that really drove a huge part for me of what Walmart sort of cemented, was this feeling I had before. But it also taught me, I think, in the same way that at Eliza, we learned we had to reach out to the people who weren't coming in. It suddenly hit me like, maybe we failed in our first attempt at Archangels because we were going through the traditional mechanisms. And yet here we are at Walmart, and there's scores of people coming through every day. 50% of the US goes through Walmart pre-COVID every single week. Oh my gosh, this is where health is happening. So if we think we're so smart, let's bring our tools, products, platforms, and solutions out to the aisles of Walmart. And so that's what we did. And that's what my job as a cashier at Walmart morphed eventually into beginning the next stage of Archangels.
I think that's so interesting. The other thing that you've mentioned now 3 times in 3 different situations is that you had to manage your own personal experience of risk and failing, and to some extent, which I literally had not put together until just now, this is why I love talking to you, is that to be good at empathy, you have to be willing to get it wrong, to like bear the shame of saying something or doing something that you cringe and say, I never want to do that again. But it's much easier to like sit in our bubble and like not have to risk that at all. That to actually take the step into doing the work that you describe, there is a direct personal cost of feeling shame.
Yeah.
How have you managed that personally? Like, how did you learn to flex that muscle?
I think I am learning to flex that muscle. And, you know, we always say at Archangels, shame is just a conversation waiting to be had. And what I have learned over the years is that when I am brave enough to say, I think I suck at everything, I'm failing at this is not working, that then there's never been a time that I've ever said that when the person I'm talking to hasn't softened themselves. All of us share that. And I had this really interesting experience with my son this past weekend where he had a project for school where he was doing something to mimic something that an artist has done. And what he chose to do was he needed to take photographs and get individuals to write down a secret on a piece of white shirt. And then he was going to put these 2 things together. And he asked me to help him do it. And he kept saying over and over again, I'm so anxious. No, how am I going to have this conversation with somebody? And I was like, let's just get started. He's like, how am I going to convince someone to tell me something that they've never told anyone before? And the theme behind it also was honesty. And the reason my son's name is Leo wanted to do the theme of honesty is he said, I went through a phase in my life when I wasn't so honest. He's 14, so he's beginning to like struggle with all this stuff. And he said, so I wanted to make it honesty because I wanted to own. And I said, well, if you tell somebody that when you ask them to tell you something they've never told anybody before, they're going to be much more open because you're admitting that something is hard for you. Ashley, over the course of our doing this project, somebody told him that they had children in another country and nobody knew. So somebody told them that their biggest fear was dying. And someone told them that they were doing something that's just also not all right in the context of what that technically would not be presumed to be all right. And that to me is a great example. And what Leo learned over the course of that period is if you are vulnerable yourself first, every single person turned around and had this extraordinary conversation where they opened up their bellies and they were like, here, this is my truth. And I think, you know, a 14-year-old can do it, but you got to practice it. You have to study it. You have to do it with intention, and it's scary. And asking someone to be vulnerable is scary, and being vulnerable yourself is scary. But I think if there was ever a time in the world where we have to reduce ourselves to reaching across the aisle, to knowing that what is similar about us is much bigger than what is different, you got to go all the way back to that. Like, tell me something you've never told anybody. Be radically transparent with me. And you're going to find something, I guarantee it, where you're going to be able to like, and find all these commonalities.
Yeah. I think that's really powerful. And I think your insight that we have to start by being vulnerable ourselves in seeding these conversations is really important. Are there anything you use either personally or professionally that you think seeds that conversation? Obviously, you gave us a great example at the top of this discussion, but you know, in your work where that may not be sort of walking into a meeting and saying, here, this is what's going on in my personal life. How else do you cultivate that?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I think that's part of where I bet if you were to lay out the next 5 to 10 massive business opportunities, they would be areas where people feel shame. And in the normalizing and destigmatizing of that area where people feel shame, those areas are massive opportunities. And let's take unpaid caregivers as an example. When my babies were little, if I had walked into a meeting with spit up all down my back, and somebody next to me had turned to me and been like, "Oh my gosh, Alex, you have spit up all down your back," everybody in the meeting would laugh. They'd be like, "Oh, when my kids were young." There's a context for a discussion around a newborn baby and the mess that a new mom or dad is as they struggle through this, that is now considered okay, right? It has been normalized. It's even considered a wonderful rite of passage, and this baby's going to grow up and it's going to be awesome and yay. That's not true with unpaid caregivers. I think one of the gifts COVID has given us is we're beginning, because people can't hide it, to see how universal it is, this glorious thing that has really, really hard components as well of being an unpaid caregiver. And I think we're finally in a situation where I could open today this, my sharing with you and I very quickly this morning, not even thinking it was going to be how we open it, I was like, Ashley, I think I'm going to throw up. Like, if I have to hang up in the middle of our thing, it's because I will have gotten a call. I'm so anxious. I can't breathe. And your reaction was so beautiful. And so like, I gotcha. What can we do? We're in this. You're okay. Right. And I think me walking into a meeting and being able to say, I'm in a situation, you know what would happen now because of COVID and because of the work that you're doing and all these other beautiful companies that are in our shared space are doing? It's getting more and more okay for someone to say that. And it's getting more and more possible that someone else in the meeting is going to turn to them and say, I'm a caregiver too. And you know what? What I struggled with was finding financial assistance or knowing how to handle all the legal stuff, or I just needed someone that I could cry to. This is where I went. Try this. I believe that in working through this shame, and I think we're starting to see this with behavioral health in general, and we just went through the huge percentage of unpaid caregivers who are struggling with behavioral health challenges / opportunities. Yeah. So I think it's that. I think it's the hope that in having these conversations, we're actually going to be able to make it so somebody can get treatment or care or love or support or whatever version term you want to use. And in the process, they will be healthier, they will live longer, and they will hopefully pass it on so that whoever they know will also get that same gift.
Yeah. I think this idea that shame is the barrier, right? When you talk about what you're seeing in your data, it's exactly going back to the data I cited at the top, right? Financial assistance, behavioral and emotional support, domestic violence. It's probably not a coincidence that the barrier or blocker here is shame. And one of the things I love about how you've evolved your thesis in healthcare is we've started with this idea that, everything's clinically based. We basically at a point in time make people take a test and then screen in or screen out to even have a conversation about these needs, versus presuming that like everyone has these needs. Everyone needs healthy food. Everyone needs emotional support. And that led you to believe that retail, right? That something about consumer created, arguably it's, you're at the hospital for an hour, you're living your life at Walmart 7 hours in a month. For us, it's about a digital technology that in the privacy of your own internet, you can capitalize on day-to-day moments and be there when the need arises. And I think that's very different. I think that's a very different way of thinking about the intersection of health and care and these needs. As you're building on your work in caregivers, is there any sort of other, process, tools that you think are particularly effective in reaching and creating these safe spaces to surface and address these needs?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I think, and I know you think this too, the digital divide is real. And so finding ways to holistically be supporting people, technology can scale. Technology is extraordinary in what it can do. Technology's greatest use is to connect humans with each other and get them access to the things that they might not otherwise have known that they needed. And I think really, when I think about what are some of the things that we've learned, it's helping. I like to think of it as data and stories. Data gives your brain permission to engage. CFO, not impressed with your awesome story, or they will be for a second. And then as soon as you leave, they're like, yeah, but that didn't do anything for me. But if you have a combination of being able to say, here's the data, and someone can be like, okay, then I'm giving my brain permission to believe this is true. And then you share a story. It's the stories that engage the heart. And it's when the heart is engaged that behavior change actually happens. And so I think it's learning to have it's like a dance between those two things, where I can almost feel on somebody, if I'm telling too many stories, you can feel them begin to be like, oh, I'm feeling a little emotional, therefore this cannot be real or valid. I'm starting to pull back, and then I'm like, bam, data. Caregivers are this, 45% are men, 1 in 4 millennials, 1 in 5 are Gen Z. They're, $470 billion of lost wages 5 years ago pre-COVID. Can you imagine what it is now? Our latest data is 68% of us, if you describe being an unpaid caregiver as worrying about or caring over the health of a family member, a friend, or a loved one, 68% of us will say yes to that. I mean, it's just incredible data. Okay, now you've got my business brain going. This is valid. I can focus on this. Now you got to start reminding people of the complexities and reminding them of the reality and reminding them of the heart component. And that while there are some very, very obvious differences in different caregiving situations, there are also these underlying themes. And I think what Archangels is really working to do is, how do we build, in our case, this caregiver intensity index that lets somebody feel validated very quickly, based on all the research we've done for freaking years, identify where are the areas that their caregiving is going well for them, because that's awesome. And we want them to do more of that. And where are the areas that they're having a particularly hard time? And then how can we crosswalk them over to resources that usually an employer has already paid for, a healthcare system has already paid for, a city community is paid for, but caregivers don't know what exists.
Yeah. Welcome. Yes.
So how do we cross
thousands of resources. And
the thing I think is so beautiful also about your population, these, the clinicians that you are working with. And I'm really been thinking a lot about, I did an interview with Rebecca Gee that you should watch if you get a second. She talks a lot about moral injury and moral despair. And when individuals came into the healthcare system to be a doctor or a nurse or a tech or whatever it is, they did it to save the world, to help humans. Yeah. And now as a doctor or a nurse or a clinician of some sorts, you're being put in these positions that are really, really close to untenable. And the behavioral health impact, meanwhile, you've been told as a healthcare clinician that you're not allowed to be weak. You cannot be vulnerable. You got to go at all costs, be tough. And meanwhile, you yourself are probably also an unpaid caregiver at home. And so I think about these paid caregivers who are also unpaid caregivers. And I hope they're, I know that they are probably accessing all of your stuff. And that makes me so happy, because they themselves put your own air mask on before helping others first.
Yeah, that's one of the areas where we've seen the biggest growth is actually in our staff tool, specifically around COVID, and also just this expression around gratitude. So we were talking, one of the most helpful life coaching things that I ever was given was, when you feel shame, you can always choose gratitude, right? There is something to be grateful for, and that is the adaptive response. And I have put that into practice in my own life. I have shared it with my best friend and some of my colleagues. And I think that, we all bump into these things, going back to shame being a barrier, and instead being able to say, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful that it allows us to unlock a lot, less human suffering, and also a lot more options in terms of where resources and support may lie. I think your comments, especially around the needs of unpaid caregivers, tease up a question from my friend, Marcy Sindel. who asks, who should fund support for unpaid caregivers? Government, health plans, employers? Obviously, as you talked about, there are a lot of resources that exist and people just don't know. And so hopefully, part of what Wellness does is step in to bridge those gaps for different populations. But we do need broader economic reform to support people who are managing this. And I know that at least in Massachusetts, beginning this year, we've made some progress in that, but would really appreciate your perspective.
So I think I love that you keep using the financial example. So I was the wellness expert for Prudential. And one of the reasons I loved that so much is I think the line between healthcare as an industry and financial services as an industry doesn't actually exist in real life. It exists I work in financial services, I work in healthcare. But if you're a human, you're just dealing with all of this and it's just a humongous mess. If you go back to the example of an unpaid caregiver, what's one of the biggest challenges for unpaid caregivers who work right now? They basically have two jobs. So I'm supposed to be doing my job in my insert wherever I am here, while I'm also an unpaid caregiver. It is very difficult, as my friend Jen Olson, who runs RCI, Rosalind Carter Institute, said, I can't be in two jobs at once. And that often is making these unpaid caregivers have to reduce their hours or actually quit their jobs so that they can go do this other job that they have. And so I don't think the answer to, who should fund these situations is one size fits all. It's employers have a very, very, very real opportunity to increase retention, to increase their ability to recruit, right? To drive bottom line impact, because caregivers cost on average, the work we do with the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, 26% poorer health. That's a real cost. All of these top and bottom line, if you take care of caregivers, this is better for your business. But if that caregiver has left already or is going to leave, guess who that cost is going to fall on? It's going to fall on the state. And so it's not enough to just look at an employer. We have to simultaneously be looking at what are the states doing? And often the states have done beautiful things, but they're not, these resources are not getting utilized enough. And mass options. And people Google mass options. If you live in Massachusetts, Google mass options or go to your state and figure out if you go to our site has it, I'm sure your site has it, places that every state has dedicated resources to support an unpaid caregiver. Use those. That's the state inadvertently funding it. You wouldn't think of it that way, but why wouldn't every big employer be saying to their employees, hey guys, here's what we offer. And by the way, when you do that, please use terminology other than, traditional boring healthcare terminology that nobody is going to go to. But look, your community also has this. The state also has this. Yeah. And then I think we're going to see the funding really change.
Yeah, I think what you are alluding to is one of the gaps that we see is a lot of this stuff exists, but the time that people need them, they're not top of mind, they're not accessible, and they're not personalized to their unique needs. And I think there's a huge opportunity in making, obviously, I think there's a huge in making that easier to find when you need it. And we need to build capacity in terms of providing additional resources and economic support, 100%. The elephant in the room is that we are white urban women who are trying to transform healthcare, and that healthcare affects everybody and it affects people who look very differently than we do, believe things very differently than what we believe, for any number of reasons, right? And so how do we do that? How do we do that empathetically, in a way that allows us to bring empathy into our own work? We started with open-ended questions, but it's easy to presume we have the answers. And if you think the set of people building companies, if we just look at the management teams, right? 11% of companies are female led. The last stats I saw were people of color as CEOs was 3%. I, as you know, sat on a board with you where I sort of flipped out and said, it's not okay to say 25% of the companies that we fund or support have exclusively white male founders. And if we look at the investor capital, so what can we do not only to like ask the right questions and bring the right people to the table, but like, where do we lead here, Alex? Like, what should we be doing to make sure that we recognize our own limitations in these conversations and instead hand the microphone over to the person or people or teams that, you know, we aspire to help?
Yeah. I think this comes back also to that listening and learning, and just acknowledging when we don't know what we don't know, and all the things that we're not the right person to be an expert. You know, I don't like that word anyway, but you know, there's other folks to be listening to.
Yeah.
And I think there's an impatience that exists in industry in general, that if you look at how things change over time, I'll use as the example Esther Dyson and the work that she's doing with Wellville. And it's a very bottoms up approach. She's picked these communities that have demonstrated that they want to affect change, that they want to change the way their communities are experiencing health, which is really life. Mm-hmm. And her team does not go in and say, this is the prescription for how you do it. They go in and say, and they just put on the table a bunch of ideas, a bunch of thoughts. They give people the chance to say what's torturing them about their situation. Muskegon is one place that Wellville is doing some amazing work. And then they recognize there are 5 Wellvilles that where the particular community has energy to fix something, they let them do it that way. Wellville is all about create fertility of ground for activists to get activated and to make the change that they know will work in their community. So if we come back to how do we fund these situations, I'm a big believer that healthcare is local, and healthcare is also there are a lot more commonalities in the things that are driving people's stress and the opportunity associated with it than we think. Yeah. And this notion of people need to be able to have purpose. They need to be able to have upward mobility. They need to be able to get a job. Probably one of the most effective healthcare campaigns we could run is get individuals jobs. Get them a job that they can use to support their family, that they can feel that they are adding value. We know the impact that has across the board. And I look for examples where I know I don't have any idea what I'm doing, but there is somebody who does, who's working really intensely, either with faith-based communities or Wellville as an example. And I say, put me to use. Like, what can I do? I'm in whatever capacity. But I am I'm a learner at this. I'm a student at how crappily a lot of our system operates.
Yeah. And I think going back to your comment and to your credit earlier, the ability to put yourself in a situation where you are completely exposed, completely at risk, is the precursor to doing any work in real empathy, and being able to have the conversation. And so I guess the elephant in the room is tomorrow we're going to inaugurate a new president. And regardless of how you voted, half the people in the country feel like the country is going in a way that is opposite than what you feel. And so as we've looked at this increased polarization over the last 20 years, to some extent fed by, wow, I need more coffee. And fed by social media and, you know, the incongruence in how we access information. What can we do, recognizing that I don't think that the things that we talked about today, how do we get a job? How do we keep our families safe? Is very polarizing, right? Like, I think at the core individual human needs around purpose and safety and opportunity are universal. And so what have you found most effective in aligning people around common goals and especially when, things are heated, things are increasingly difficult to have those conversations in a way that's productive.
So I'm terrible at politics. And I'm terrible at listening to podcasts. By some sheer great luck, my man's like, you have to listen to the New York Times daily, whatever. And I was scrolling through it on a run, and I was like, fine, I'll do it. And there was one on that Kamala Harris did. And it was called on being an ideologue. And I was like, I don't know what an ideologue is. And I always feel shame at how stupid I am about politics. So I was like, well, I'm just going to listen to it. And it was transformative for me. This was when she was running for president. And she walked through, she said, well, an ideologue is somebody who's not running on a platform like I'm Republican, I'm Democrat. They're running essentially on the things that wake people up in the middle of the night. And she said to this guy, do you know how much money on average, the guy was interviewing her, like the average American has in savings? And the guy's like, I don't know. She's like, less than $400. Conversation keeps going. And she's talking about one of the things that I really believe in is infrastructure and things like our roads. And we have to invest in our roads. And that's not a blue thing or a red thing. Because if our roads don't work, guess what? You need new tires. Do you know how much a new set of 4 tires costs? And the guy's like, I don't know. Said $400. And for me, I was like, bam, that's what I believe in. What I believe in is reduce everything down from the political statement, from the whatever statement, to what's waking real people up in the middle of the night. And then what's helping them go back to sleep because they feel hope that they can do something about it. We need to fix our roads. Every problem we're trying to solve, there is a common factor at the bottom of it. And that to me is what I'm so hungry to see more and more examples of us as a country doing that effectively.
I think that's a great place to leave us. I am hopeful that we can find more and more of those opportunities, not only sort of as we have a new administration, but also as we think about our own work and where we can drive alignment, because there's a lot of work to do. There, as you just sort of started with today, there is universal suffering. And so starting with how can we support one another, I think, has the opportunity to unlock a lot of great progress in the next 12 months if we can find those areas of alignment. So Alex, as always, you're fabulous. I'm so grateful for you.
Thank you for your support today and for, helping me as I had my almost throw up moment. And I appreciate that.
No, I appreciate you. So thanks. And keep up the great work with family caregivers, ARCHANGELS. I think, the more we swing away and make mistakes, the closer we get to something that, has real value for all of us. So thank you for that work. And I look forward to seeing you and giving you a big hug, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Exactly. Right back at you.
All right. Bye, Alex.